There was something different about the home at the end of Larkspur Road. It stood among the others, a simple house with drawn curtains, a quiet front porch, and a garden that never seemed tended but never grew wild. It was a place people passed without much thought, yet those who looked too long always felt something uneasy stir within them. For years, the house kept its secrets well. Neighbors knew little of the family inside, just a mother and her two sons. No visitors, no friends, no relatives ever came calling. The lights in the windows glowed late into the night, sometimes flickering as if shadows moved where they shouldn't. To the outside world, there was nothing to see. But inside, the walls told a different story. One of the boys, now a man, would later say it was all normal at first. Chores, dinners at the table, a mother who made sure they were always together. Always. She kept them close, closer than most parents would. They were homeschooled. No school dances, no weekend trips with friends. When they were young, it felt like love. When they were older, it felt like a cage. One son, the eldest, tried to leave once. He packed a bag and made it to the front door. He hesitated, his fingers grazing the handle. That's when he heard it, the slow creak of the floor behind him, the presence of someone standing too close. His mother's voice was soft when she spoke, almost loving, but the words made his blood run cold. "You belong here." That night, the locks were changed. A second bolt added to the front door, the windows secured, the keys tucked away where only she could reach. From then on, the house was different. The air inside grew heavy, thick with something that didn't belong. There were rules, always rules. Curfews that didn't matter because there was nowhere to go. Conversations that ended with their mother's gaze lingering too long. Questions that went unanswered, replaced by silence. And then there was the basement, a place neither son dared to enter after dark. Not because they were afraid of what was in it, but because they feared what would happen if they did. Years passed, and the town barely noticed them anymore. They were ghosts in a living house, until the day the youngest son walked into the police station, his hands shaking, his face pale. He said only 5 words before collapsing onto the floor. "She won't let us go." After the youngest son's collapse at the police station, officers scrambled to make sense of his words. Paramedics lifted his trembling body onto a stretcher, but his hands clung to the sleeve of the nearest officer. His grip was weak, yet desperate. "There are things in the house," he whispered. "You have to listen. You have to—" His voice faded as exhaustion overtook him. The officers exchanged glances. A welfare check was protocol, but none of them expected what they would find behind that locked door. When they knocked, there was no answer, no movement, no sound. Just the steady hum of the porch light, buzzing in the late evening air. Then a shadow appeared behind the curtain, a flicker of movement, a single eye peering through the fabric before it was gone. A moment later, the locks clicked, one after another, each metallic snap echoing too loudly in the quiet street. The door opened, just wide enough to reveal her, the mother, a woman with tired eyes and a smile that didn't quite fit her face. She tilted her head slightly, her voice smooth and measured. "Can I help you, officers?" They explained the situation, her son's collapse, his fear, his desperate plea for help. She listened, nodding as if each word was something she expected to hear. Then she sighed. "I'm afraid my son has always had an overactive imagination." The officers hesitated. Behind her, the house was dark, too dark. A home should have warmth, the glow of lamps, the signs of life. But this one was hollow, its shadows stretching further than they should. "We'd still like to come in," one of the officers finally said. The woman's smile didn't falter, but her grip on the door tightened. A moment stretched between them, long enough for doubt to creep in. Then with a slow nod, she stepped aside. "Of course," she said. "Come in." As they crossed the threshold, a faint noise whispered through the hallway, a sound like breathing, but too deep, too steady. The officers exchanged glances, stepping further inside. The door clicked shut behind them. The house had them now. The officers moved through the house with careful steps, their boots barely making a sound against the hardwood floors. The mother trailed behind them, watching, waiting. A hallway stretched before them, lined with family portraits. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. A smiling mother, two young boys. But as one officer squinted in the dim light, something felt off. The mother's smile was always the same, identical, unchanging. Each picture taken years apart, yet she never aged. The younger officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, where is your other son?" The mother's expression didn't shift. "Sleeping." "Could we see him?" A pause. A breath too long. Then she nodded. "Of course." She led them to a door at the end of the hall. It was locked. Her fingers trembled as she produced a key from her pocket, slipping it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a darkened room. Inside, a figure lay curled on the bed, motionless beneath a heavy blanket. The officer hesitated, then stepped closer. His hand reached out, then stopped. The blanket was smooth, untouched, as if no one had moved beneath it in hours. The officer pulled it back. The bed was empty. From behind them, a whisper. "He's always here." The lights flickered. The air turned thick, suffocating. The officers turned sharply. The mother was smiling. This time it reached her eyes. The house was suffocating now, its presence pressing in from all sides. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Something wasn't right. The air felt stagnant, untouched by time. The older officer spoke first. "Ma'am, where is your son?" The mother's smile never wavered. "He's still here." The younger officer scanned the room, his eyes landing on a door slightly ajar at the end of the hall. A staircase descended into darkness beyond it. "The basement," he murmured. The mother's gaze followed his. Something flickered in her expression, just for a second. Then she stepped back, folding her hands in front of her. "If you must." The officers hesitated, then descended. The floorboards groaned under their weight. The walls felt too close. A smell, damp, metallic, curled in the air. Then they saw it. The chains, the cot, the remnants of something long kept hidden, and the whispers that never stopped. The silence in the basement was deceptive. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. The officers took another step forward, their flashlights cutting through the thick shadows. Then something moved. A figure, gaunt and hollow-eyed, emerging from the darkness. And he was smiling too. The silence in the house grew unbearable. The officers exchanged glances, their unease deepening. The mother took a step closer. "You should leave now." But something wasn't right. The older officer's gaze fell to the floorboards, where a faint rhythmic sound pulsed beneath the wood. Breathing. Something was beneath them. The younger officer stepped back, his hand hovering over his holster. "We need to see the basement." The mother's smile finally faltered. "No." A pause, the air grew heavier. Then the officer reached for the door to the basement. The lock was new. The key was in her pocket. And from the darkness below, something shifted. The key trembled in the mother's hand. She clutched it tightly, her knuckles white. The officers didn't wait. One of them stepped forward, reaching into his belt for a tool. The lock was strong, but not unbreakable. A sharp snap echoed through the air as the door creaked open. The darkness below seemed endless. Then something moved. The first step down sent a groan through the old wooden stairs. The younger officer hesitated, his flashlight casting long shadows against the damp stone walls. The air was thick, stagnant, suffocating. The older officer stepped forward, his voice low. "Stay close." The mother remained at the top of the stairs, her figure shrouded in the dim light. Her hands rested on the railing, unmoving. The descent continued. One step, another. Then, a noise. Software. Wet. A whisper of movement against the cold basement floor. The younger officer tightened his grip on his weapon. "There's something down here." The beam of light passed over shelves lined with jars. Contents murky, unidentifiable. The scent of damp earth and something metallic clung to the air. Then the light landed on something else. A door. Small, almost hidden beneath a stack of crates. A lock, rusted but intact, sealed it shut. The officers exchanged glances. The younger officer reached for the lock. A sharp breath from behind them. They turned just in time to see the mother stepping down onto the last stair. She was no longer smiling. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. And then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. The basement held its breath. The officers froze, ears straining for movement. Then a sound, a rustling, too close. The younger officer fumbled for his flashlight. His fingers trembled against the switch. A single beam cut through the pitch black. The mother was gone. A whisper of movement, a breath against the nape of the younger officer's neck. Then the floor shifted beneath him. The boards groaned, a hollow sound that didn't match the solid ground they had stepped on earlier. The younger officer knelt, pressing his palm to the wood. A faint tremor, a heartbeat beneath the house. The officers hesitated, their flashlights trembling as they stepped deeper into the underground passage. The walls were lined with rotting wood, the air thick with something they couldn't quite name. A steady dripping echoed from somewhere unseen. Then the whisper came again. Not words, not a voice they recognized, just a sound, a presence breathing between the walls. The younger officer took a step forward. His foot landed on something soft, flesh. He recoiled, his flashlight sweeping the space ahead. And then, a pair of eyes, then another, and another. The light caught gaunt faces, hollow cheeks, trembling fingers clutching at the damp floor. Shadows moved, revealing figures curled against the walls, their skin pale, their bodies frail. Their eyes darted to the officers, then past them, toward the basement door. And then, all at once, they spoke. "She keeps us here." The mother's voice rose from the stairwell above. "You weren't supposed to find them." The officers turned, their weapons raised, but she wasn't there anymore. The basement door slammed shut, and the locks clicked into place. The door to the hidden room groaned as it opened. The air that seeped out was thick with the weight of years, with something unspoken and unclean. The officers hesitated. Their flashlights trembled. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, images of the two sons captured at every stage of their lives. Some were recent, too recent. Others were old, their edges curling with time. In each, their mother's presence loomed, her arms wrapped around them, her gaze lingering, her grip never letting go. And then there was the chair. At the center of the room, a single wooden chair sat facing the wall. The ropes around its arms were frayed, the impression of hands still visible in the worn wood. A shudder ran through the younger officer. Something scraped against the floor. They turned, their beams landing on the mother. She stood in the doorway, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I told you," she whispered. "They belong to me." And then the door slammed shut. The lights flickered. A breath of movement in the darkness. A whisper that wasn't theirs. And the house finally revealed its last secret. Chapter 15. The Last Revelation. Narrator. The door to the hidden room groaned as it opened. The air that seeped out was thick with the weight of years, with something unspoken and unclean. The officers hesitated. Their flashlights trembled. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, images of the two sons, captured at every stage of their lives. Some were recent, too recent. Others were old, their edges curling with time. In each, their mother's presence loomed, her arms wrapped around them, her gaze lingering, her grip never letting go. And then there was the chair. At the center of the room, a single wooden chair sat facing the wall. The ropes around its arms were frayed, the impression of hands still visible in the worn wood. A shudder ran through the younger officer. Something scraped against the floor. They turned, their beams landing on the mother. She stood in the doorway, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I told you," she whispered. "They belong to me." And then the door slammed shut. The lights flickered. A breath of movement in the darkness. A whisper that wasn't theirs. The officers fought against the door, their shoulders slamming into the wood. A loud crack echoed as it burst open, sending them stumbling back into the hallway. The woman was gone. A search began, but she had vanished. Only her voice remained, a faint murmur in the house's hollow corridors. A lullaby sung to no one. The sons were taken away, given new names, new lives.